Number 10. German Dornier bomber. Off the coast of Kent in the UK, workers managed to bring up from the depths of the English Channel a Dornier DO-17 bomber. This military aircraft was used in World War II and has been rusting at the bottom of the channel for over 70 years. Experts believe it could be the very last of its kind in existence. These planes were originally manufactured by Germany as part of their Luftwaffe Air Force, but they were all either destroyed in the fighting, scrapped after the war, or simply lost. Not all the pieces of the plane were pulled out of the water. There are still a few chunks missing. According to historical records, the plane itself was shot down in August of 1940. 2 of the crew members died during the action, but the pilot and another crew member survived and became prisoners of war. The wreckage was first spotted by divers in 2008, and it took a grant of nearly $400,000 from the National Heritage Memorial Fund to finally fish the crashed plane out of the water all these years later. Now the bomber will be restored to its former glory and put on display. Number 9. Stolen skeleton. In 2010, marine archaeologists discovered a creepy underwater Mexican cave. Inside the cave were human remains from thousands of years ago, including a full skeleton. But when the marine archaeologists went back to do some more digging in 2012, they were shocked to see that somebody had stolen the skeleton. Someone dived into the underwater nightmare of tunnels and caverns, took the skeleton of a person who died around 12,000 years ago, and then brought it to the surface and did who knows what with it. The problem was that archaeologists posted the discovery on social media when they found the skeleton. Somebody with the right equipment must have seen the post and went down there to take the human remains for themselves. Sarah Gibson, a paleontologist involved in the initial discovery, said in a blog post that only 10% of the skeleton was left behind because it was embedded in the rock, too difficult to be extracted by underwater grave robbers. As for who the skeleton belonged to 12,000 years ago, researchers believe it was a teenage girl. She was part of the first group of people to ever call the Yucatan Peninsula home, thousands and thousands of years before the Maya civilization ever existed. Number 8. Sherman tanks. A pair of American Sherman tanks have been brought up from the bottom of the Barents Sea. These tanks were discovered sunk off the coast of Russia, with experts believing they were on board the Thomas Donaldson. The Thomas Donaldson was a merchant ship from America that sank when attacked by Germans on March 20, 1945. At the time the ship was sunk, it was carrying a huge load of supplies for the Soviets. Some of these supplies included the American Sherman tanks. Sadly for the crew of the Thomas Donaldson, it was the 20th ship in its convoy. It was the last to enter the Kola Inlet and was picked off like the weakest wolf in a pack by a German U-boat. A torpedo ripped through the starboard side, struck the engine room, killed 3 people, and destroyed the engines. Everybody else abandoned the ship, but the supplies and the tanks went down with the vessel. Just recently, it was the Russians who went through all the trouble of bringing the tanks out of the water. They're in rough shape, but not so destroyed that they can't be restored and displayed in a museum somewhere. Number 7. Message in a bottle. A woman in Michigan discovered a message in a bottle that had been sitting on the bottom of the Sheboygan River for 95 years. She had met a potential diving client and, to try to entice them to go on a trip, started fishing around for cool stuff on the riverbed. She scooped out a giant clamshell about 12 feet deep. Then she noticed a green bottle sitting in the muck. She extracted the bottle from the river and was shocked to see that there was a message sealed inside the glass. She quickly went back to her boat and popped the cork to see what the letter said. Unfortunately, the bottle was about 2/3 filled with water. It was difficult to read exactly what the letter said, but 4 numbers stuck out like a sore thumb: 1926. With the help of her first mate, this woman was able to decipher the message in the bottle. It said, "Would whoever finds this bottle return the paper inside to George Morrow and say exactly where it was found?" George Morrow was dead, but after a quick Facebook post, his daughter contacted the woman who found the message in the bottle. Her name is Michelle Primo, and she said that her father would often float notes in bottles whenever he went on vacation at the Sheboygan River. Judging by the date, he had sent this particular message in a bottle on his 18th birthday about a century ago. If you could leave a message in a bottle and know that someone will find it in 100 years, what would you write on it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. Number 6. Golden Ray Shipwreck. The last chunk of the Golden Ray Shipwreck was recently removed from the water off the coast of Georgia. It was the final piece of an excavation that went on for nearly a year after the Golden Ray tipped over with 4,200 cars in its cargo deck. The Golden Ray was a South Korean freighter with a weight of over 4,410 tons, 4,480 metric tons. It capsized in September of 2019 after leaving the port of Brunswick. All the crew members were able to be saved, but the ship itself was a total loss. Not only was the ship destroyed, but over $204 million worth of goods were lost to the ocean. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, it was an officer error that caused the ship to flip, as the officer in charge miscalculated the stability of the vessel. Its center of gravity was too high, causing it to capsize. Demolition work on the sunken ship started the November after it was broken, but was delayed a few times, once by a giant fire that engulfed the chunks of boat still poking out of the surface. Now the last big piece has been removed from the water, though there is still a massive amount of debris down there. What would you do if you saw a boat in flames on the water? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe before the end of the video. Number 5. An ancient canoe. From a lake in Wisconsin, a 1,200-year-old canoe has been pulled from the water. According to maritime archaeologists with the Wisconsin Historical Society, carbon dating shows that the remarkable artifact was carved around the year 800. This was centuries before the Europeans ever made it to the region of the Great Lakes. It's likely the oldest intact water vessel ever found in Wisconsin. The canoe was carved from a single tree, though it's unclear which tribe was responsible for making it. Researchers discovered it 30 feet (9.1 meters) beneath Lake Mendota, where it had been resting for an undetermined amount of time. The canoe was immediately taken to a preservation facility in Wisconsin and then placed in a special storage vat. The vat is filled with water and biodeterrent to prevent the canoe from deteriorating further. This preservation process to safeguard the canoe for historical prosperity will take another 3 years. Number 4. Lost treasure. Divers in Indonesia found an amazing lost hoard of treasure from the Srivijaya Empire. They rescued buckets and buckets of gold and jewels from the bottom of the Musi River in a spot where archaeologists believe a mysterious city once stood. The Srivijaya Empire controlled trade moving through huge parts of Asia between the 7th century and the 11th century. Their major city was located on the Musi River, a kind of island of gold. But the kingdom lost its power in 1025 when the Chola dynasty from India overtook them as the top traders in the region. From there, nobody's entirely sure what happened. We know that in the 7th century, the city on the Musi River called Palembang was home to over 1,000 Buddhist monks. It was a popular city for travelers moving from China to India to stop and study Sanskrit. We also know that they were ultimately snuffed out by the Java kingdom and pushed into extinction. Very little evidence of their society remains today, which is what makes this newest discovery so amazing. For an ancient kingdom that has barely any archaeological proof of it left, pulling up buckets of coins, gold rings, and even temple bells is something of a miracle. Number 3. Dead pirates. Researchers discovered human remains inside the ruins of an old shipwreck that was once captained by Samuel Bellamy, or Black Sam for short. He was one of the wealthiest and most infamous pirates of all time, born in 1689. He plundered more than Blackbeard, though his career as a pirate was quite short. In 1717, April 26th to be exact, his ship, the Whydah, was wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod, and he died. The ship was rediscovered in 1984 by the explorer Barry Clifford, who actually used a map from 1717 to locate the site. It was found under barely 14 feet (4.26 meters) of water 260 years after it sank. Over 200,000 pieces of ship and treasure have been retrieved since then. The ship's bell was recovered, entire buckets of silver, and even dead pirates. As of right now, pirate skeletons found fossilized and hardened pieces of rock taken from the sunken vessel are being tested. Scientists are looking at the DNA to try and figure out if one of the pirate skeletons belongs to the infamous captain, Black Sam. Number 2. Barnacled sword of a Crusader knight. Off the coast of Israel, a scuba diver recovered a perfectly preserved sword from 900 years ago. The sword once belonged to a Crusader knight, and even though it was found crusted with barnacles and covered in sand on the seafloor, it's still a remarkable and imposing weapon. The sword wasn't the only thing pulled out of the water. Shlomi Katzin also found metal anchors and fragments of pottery, all dating back to the era of the Crusades between 1095 and 1291. The sword measures about 3 feet (0.9 meters) in length. It's made of iron, and it was almost definitely owned by a European missionary who traveled to the Middle East between the 11th and 13th centuries as part of the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of wars in which the Europeans tried to convert the Muslim nations of the Middle East to Christianity by extreme force. We don't know how the sword got lost underwater for almost 1,000 years, but it could have been down there much longer if not for the diver and the shifting sands. It's likely that he showed up at just the right time to see a piece of the sword exposed. Once the sword is cleaned of its barnacles, it'll be put on display for everyone to see. Number 1. The city of HERACLEION. The Egyptian city of HERACLEION has been underwater for about 3,000 years. It was lost in the 8th century BC, hundreds of years before a single stone was laid for the foundation of the city of Alexandria. HERACLEION was there first as the original port of entry for all ships moving from Greece into Egypt. But a monumental disaster caused the entire city to slip into the ocean. Temples, statues, roads, houses, the whole city was submerged, likely by a tsunami-earthquake combo that caused the ground to liquidate. The French diver Franck Gaudiot was the one who finally discovered the city in the year 2000. Ever since he identified the ruins of this place off the coast of Alexandria, he's been bringing the most incredible discoveries out of the water. He and his team have rescued giant statues carved from granite in the form of gods, like Hapi, god of fertility and abundance. They've rescued statues of pharaohs, queens, and gold plaques. Stone by stone and year by year, the ancient city of HERACLEION is getting hoisted out of its watery grave. Number 8. Secret Nazi Base. As the Nazis rose to power during the 1930s, they decided that they wanted to claim part of Antarctica as their own. Toward the end of the decade, an expedition traveled to the continent to survey the region and search for lucrative opportunities. One of their goals was to find alternatives to oil and fat-based products like butter, milk, cream, lard, bacon, margarine, and candles. At the time, Germany depended heavily on the import of these items from other countries. The Nazis wanted to be prepared for self-sufficiency in the case they were barred from trade as a consequence of their actions. Whale oil was a key ingredient in margarine, so it appealed to the Germans as a potentially valuable resource, and Antarctica seemed like it might be an appropriate place to find and harvest it. The Germans typically bought whale oil from Norway, but didn't want to give the country their business. They embarked on the Antarctic expedition in December 1938, heading toward an area now known as Dronning Maudland, but the Norwegians beat the Nazis to the region by an entire month and staked their claim to it. The Germans disputed this, and in 1939 they asserted their own ownership of the area and named it Neuschwabenland after the expedition's ship. They planned 2 future voyages, which never happened due to escalating tensions between the Axis and Allied powers. At some point, rumors began circulating about a secret Nazi facility in Antarctica called Base 22. While it's believed that the Germans did plan to build a base there, there's no evidence to indicate that they turned this vision into a reality. They abandoned their claim to the territory in 1945 as the war drew to a close, and it became increasingly clear that the Allies were going to win. Number 7. Salina Turda. Salina Turda is one of the world's oldest salt mines. Located in modern-day Romania, its history dates at least as far back as the Middle Ages. Some historians believe that mining activities may have started during the Roman era, but there's no clear evidence to say one way or the other. It's possible that any signs of it were destroyed over time. Over 3 billion tons of salt were mined at Salina Turda between then and 1932, when the mine officially closed. The site, which lies 400 feet, 122 meters underground, has been used for various purposes since then. During World War II, it functioned as a bomb shelter. At one point, the mine was used as a cheese warehouse. Salina Turda opened to tourists in 1992. Today, it's home to a sci-fi themed amusement park. It features numerous attractions, including a Ferris wheel, an underground lake with row and paddle boats, ping pong, a bowling alley, an amphitheater, and many golf courses. The mine also has a spa where it offers salt-based wellness treatments known as halotherapy. Those who are more interested in Salina Turda's history can see some of the mines firsthand and visit the museum. The Krivac room features a rudimentary machine that was used at the site starting in 1881. In the Terezia mine, there's an underground lake with a salt island in the middle. There's a panoramic elevator in the Rudolf mine offering visitors a stunning view of the facility, and the Losef mine is famous for its powerful echo. Salina Turda has enough unmined salt to provide for the entire planet for 60 years should the need ever arise. Number 6. Don Juan Pond. If you wanted to visit the world's saltiest body of water, you'd be out of luck. It can only be seen in satellite images because it's located in Antarctica. The ankle-deep Don Juan Pond is situated in the lowest part of the upper right valley. With a salinity level of 40%, it's saltier than even the Dead Sea, which is 34% saline. Temperatures in the region drop as low as -58 degrees Fahrenheit, -50 degrees Celsius during the winter. But the Don Juan Pond never freezes due to its salt content. Scientists know relatively little about the pond, including whether it supports microscopic life. If it does, then it means that at some point, life may have existed on Mars, which is chock full of salt and had abundant water until around 3 billion years ago. Speaking with NASA, geologist Jay Dixon explained that life has been detected near the pond and that the water body itself contains possible evidence of biological activity. But scientists will need to take a closer look because the activity they've observed could be caused by non-living processes. Researchers once thought that this hypersaline lake was fed by an underground water source, but they now believe that the salt draws in moisture from the atmosphere in a process called deliquescence. Just like any body of water, the Don Juan Pond has changed over time. It's much smaller and shallower than it used to be. During the early 90s, its maximum depth was estimated to be about 1 foot, 30.5 centimeters. By 1997, its depth had reduced to just 3.9 inches, 10 centimeters, and it nearly dried up completely the following year. Number 5. North Star Missile Silo. Kansas is probably one of the last places most people would expect to find a decommissioned Cold War-era structure, and you're unlikely to spot one in plain sight. But if you look really hard, you'll find a lone, seemingly out-of-place doorway a few miles east of Gypsum. Behind that door, there's a staircase that descends 200 feet, 61 meters underground, to what's known as the North Star Missile Silo. Built during the Cold War era as one of 12 storage places for holding nuclear weapons, the silo was designed to protect missiles and their launch crews from an incoming blast, and to facilitate a rapid response to an attack. It was constructed with the strongest concrete that was available at the time and was reinforced with a steel framework equipped with springs that acted as shock absorbers. The amount of concrete that went into building the silos could pave a 6-inch, 15.2 centimeter thick, 20-foot, 6.1 meter wide highway from St. Louis to Chicago, according to the official North Star Missile Silo website. Each structure came with a hefty price tag of $110 million, which would amount to over $1 billion today. The North Star Missile Silo was decommissioned in 1965 after then-President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed that only a crazy person who wanted to destroy the world would resort to nuclear war. While Cold War tensions and widespread fear of nuclear war were far from over, this mutual understanding made U.S. officials feel comfortable enough to disarm the 12 silos. The North Star Silo is one of few that remain intact today. It sits on an 18-acre, 7.3 hectares property that's currently for sale for $989,000. Developer Paul Novitska cleaned and partially renovated the structure last year, leaving it ready for whomever decides to turn it into their own private bunker or living space. Are there any Cold War relics you're super interested in? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're telling us, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Number 4. Exeter's Underground Tunnels. England is famous for its underground history. Over the centuries, as new civilizations conquered the land and as societies upgraded their infrastructures, they built new streets and buildings on top of old ones. And as space above ground became increasingly scarce, builders began implementing subterranean tunnels and passages as a way to bypass the bustling crowds and get from point A to point B more quickly, and to deliver utilities to the population. Beneath Exeter, there's a series of medieval tunnels unlike any other throughout the country. Built during the 14th century, these crude, narrow labyrinths carried clean drinking water to residents from natural springs on the city's outskirts. A series of lead pipes brought the water right into the heart of the metropolis at a time when having easy access to the precious commodity was a luxury. Most people couldn't afford to have it piped directly into their home, and the tunnels were designed mainly for merchants. But it also carried water to a public fountain, making it easier for Exeter's residents to obtain. Knowing that the system would need maintenance, its builders ensured that the vaulted tunnels were just big enough for workers to navigate, and they implemented various entry points so that it was easy to access them. The tunnels were sealed off during England's Civil War to prevent them from being used as a way to secretly encroach upon the city. They were reopened after the fighting ended and remained in use until a cholera epidemic hit Exeter during the 19th century. At that point, it became clear that the city needed more water sources, and steps were taken to get away from well water and modernize the system. The passages were closed in 1901 once these upgrades were completed. Over the years, they were forgotten about and fell into disrepair. The first guided tours were offered during the 1930s amid a renewed interest in the tunnels. There are different sections which were built at different times, with each containing its own unique archaeological history. Number 3. Church of San Juan Parangaricutiro. One day in 1943, a volcano began forming in a farmer's field in the Mexican state of Michoacán. As it erupted, the ground shook, causing church bells to ring 2 miles away, 3.2 kilometers away in the village of San Juan Parangaricutiro. Within a year, the lava and ashes reached San Juan and buried most of it, along with the nearby town of Paricutin. The volcanic outflow breached the church's cemetery walls and covered the gravestones, leaving only the building's tower and altar untouched. By then, residents had evacuated, and thankfully nobody was harmed. But their town was destroyed, and the volcano continued to erupt for another 8 years. With no end to the destruction in sight, they rebuilt the village and constructed a new church in an area that was unaffected by the eruptions. They named it Nuevo San Juan Parigaricutiro, which translates to New San Juan Parigaricutiro. Today, the ruins of the old town are almost completely covered, with the church protruding from the volcanic deposits as the only reminder of the village that once existed there. The Paricutin volcano, which was absent from the landscape just decades ago, can be seen off in the distance. It's one of the world's youngest volcanoes. When the eruptions finally stopped, its peak had reached an elevation of 9,186 feet, 2,808 meters. But it'll never get any taller because it's a monogenetic volcano, which means it will never erupt again. Number 2. Petite Ceinture. Petite Ceinture is French for Little Belt. This is the name of an old railroad that loops around central Paris, but is no longer in use today. From 1862 to 1934, it offered connections between main train stations and fortified the city. The Petite Ceinture gradually became obsolete due to urban sprawl and the implementation of the Paris Metro subway system. Nature has reclaimed the site with over 200 plant species and 70 animals occupying stretches of the abandoned railroad. Its bridges and tunnels remain intact, with graffiti and occasional visitors serving as the only signs of a human presence. Several sections of the Petite Ceinture are open to the public, including a nature trail that opened in 2008. Travel blogger Sophie Nadeau described the walkways as an eerily silent escape in the midst of a bustling city. The closed portions of the railroad attract urban explorers, but with dark, rat-infested tunnels and rough terrain, they aren't ideal for inexperienced adventurers. Anyway, why risk your safety in getting arrested for trespassing when you can freely enjoy the areas that welcome visitors? Number 1. Ireland's Alcatraz. People fled Ireland in droves in the mid-19th century during what became known as the Great Potato Famine. But not everyone had the choice to leave. As immigrants sailed out of Cork Harbor, they caught a rare glimpse of Spike Island, which was home to the country's most notorious prison. Many of the inmates it housed were locked up for theft, which was on the rise as millions of the country's residents suffered on the brink of starvation. The sprawling complex originally functioned as a military base, but was later converted into a penitentiary to accommodate an overflow of prisoners from other facilities. Opened in 1847, it was a virtual hell on earth. Designed to hold just a few hundred convicts, the overcrowded prison housed as many as 2,500 people at its peak population. In fact, it was once the world's largest prison. The drinking water was contaminated with sewage, and medical care was poor at best, with just one doctor available to treat inmates. Prisoners were malnourished while forced to perform brutal hard labor. Consequently, over 1,000 inmates died during the first 7 years of operation. They were buried in a cemetery on the island, which was eventually covered with landfill to cover up the mass deaths that were occurring there. The Spike Island prison continued to operate until the late 20th century, when it became a youth correctional facility. It closed its doors for good in 2004 and has since become a tourist attraction. There are numerous underground tunnels and fortresses at the site, which were sealed up when they were no longer needed. They've only been partially excavated. Last year, archaeologists found a hidden stone staircase and tunnel dating back to the 18th century. In it, they found animal bones and wine bottles, some of which were half full. As more discoveries continue to be made, experts are piecing together a more complete picture of the site's complex history and what really went on at the prison at a time when oversight was minimal and treatment toward criminals was draconian at best. Number 10. Tank Graveyard. There's an amazing underwater graveyard filled with armored vehicles that sank back in April of 1944. And when I say armored vehicles, I mostly mean tanks of the amphibious variety. These World War II-era military assets were completely destroyed and ended up at the bottom of the ocean during Operation Smash. The operation was a training exercise held on Dorset Beach in England, in which the Allied forces practiced what they would do when they stormed the beaches of Normandy. The tanks that are now lost underwater forever helped to alter the course of history by preventing what could have been a failed siege of France. If it hadn't been for the sacrifice of these amphibious tanks, history as we know it may be completely different today. D-Day could have gone horribly wrong and the Allies could have failed. Operation Smash was carried out just a few weeks ahead of D-Day. British and Canadian tanks were launched from shallow water as practice for what they would do when they reached the shores of France. 32 tanks were launched and 7 of them sank, resulting in 6 deaths. It was a tragedy that meant when D-Day finally came, British and Canadian forces did not launch their amphibious tanks too early. Still, most of the tanks that did make it onto the beach on D-Day were destroyed pretty much immediately. Number 9. CHURCHILL'S Silver. In a miraculous archaeological breakthrough, divers discovered a sunken treasure from World War II worth over $150 million in today's currency. The treasure once belonged to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It wasn't his personal money, but was rather funds appropriated for the war effort in Britain. Winston Churchill had long organized a load of silver to be brought from India to help pay for Britain's campaign against the Nazis. The ship carrying the funds was the SS Gersapa. But unfortunately for everyone on board, the ship exhausted most of its fuel while on the way to Ireland and was helpless when a German U-boat attacked. The German submarine fired a torpedo, the SS Gersapa sank, and all 85 lives aboard were lost. The riches on the ship were also lost, at least until now. The silver was finally found in 2011 by Odyssey Marine, a group of researchers who managed to recover 99% of the silver from the shipwreck. In total, there were 7 million ounces of silver on the sunken ship. Unfortunately, we don't actually know how much money the recovery company was allowed to claim and how much they had to give back to the government. Number 8. Nazi warship. The wreckage of a German warship that got blown apart by a British submarine in 1940 was found off the coast of Norway. It was the operator of Norway's electric grid that located the shipwreck by accident in 2017. The Norwegians were doing sonar scans of the sea floor prior to laying underwater power cables when they identified the massive warship still sitting upright at the bottom of the sea. Shortly after the discovery was made, the company sent down remotely operated vehicles to inspect the wreckage. It turned out to be the old wreck of the German cruiser called the Karlsruhe. The cruiser was launched in 1927 and was one of the most technologically advanced for its time, able to reach a top speed of 37 miles per hour. In 1936, it was part of German patrols watching the coast of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. It was then refitted when World War II broke out and sent into action in 1940. The Karlsruhe was part of an attack group during the German invasion of Norway. According to archaeologist Fru Kvalo from the Norwegian Maritime Museum, the ship's offensive capabilities proved to be significant. It left the city of Kristiansand decimated, even though it took fire from Norwegian artillery. After the attack, it was on its way back to Germany when it was surprised by a British submarine called the Truant. The Truant blasted a pair of large holes in the hull of the warship, leaving it dead in the water. 2 hours later, it had completely sunk. Number 7. Douglas Dakota DC-3. During World War II, the Douglas Dakota DC-3 was a transporter plane used to move troops from one place to another, including dropping paratroopers inside of Nazi Germany. One of these transport planes is currently lying at the bottom of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea to be exact. According to the Daily Mail, this particular Douglas Dakota was used by a Turkish paratroop regiment during the war. But today it's 60 feet, over 18 meters beneath the surface of the ocean, home to nothing but the native underwater creatures. Oh yes, and don't forget the random barracuda that swims through the hull of this dead war machine. How did the Douglas Dakota sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean? It wasn't an accident. Its twin propeller engines didn't explode during battle. It was sunk intentionally in 2009 off the coast of the Turkish city Kars to be an underwater playground for divers to explore. Number 6. The USS Inaugural. In 2021, shockingly low levels of water in the Mississippi River have exposed a sunken warship that sank near downtown St. Louis almost 30 years ago. The ship is the USS Inaugural, previously moored near to the Gateway Arch. But in 1993, it accidentally broke from its moorings and drifted downstream. The ship eventually flipped on its side and sank near the Poplar Street Bridge. Ever since, no one had seen the ship, and to be honest, most people have just forgotten about it. But now, with the water level down to a staggering 3.85 feet, its hull has been exposed for the first time in years. It hasn't been seen since 2012 and 2015 when the Mississippi River was previously exceptionally low. During the war, the USS Inaugural was a minesweeper that went into service on October 1, 1944. It participated in the invasion of Okinawa and continued searching for mines in the waters around Japan and Korea, clearing a total of 82 before going back to the U.S. It was awarded 2 battle stars for its service and then decommissioned in 1946. It was relocated to St. Louis in 1968 and turned into a floating museum, then lost by the tragic accident in 1993. Number 5. Bombs in the coral. Bombs left behind from World War II have been found hiding amongst prized coral off the coast of Hawaii. These bombs are an explicit danger to divers, considering this is one of the most popular dive destinations in the entire world. So far, the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources say that they've found 2 potential live bombs in a coral habitat. They were located off the south shore of Lanai. And while the department thought they had found a third bomb, it proved to be nothing except an empty pipe. For those who don't know much about diving, the island of Lanai in Hawaii attracts amateur and professional divers from across the globe. It's because the seafloor here is a mixture of lava tubes and incredibly unique corals that create a breathtaking seascape of an almost alien-like nature. And yet only 300 yards, 274 meters from the shore, and about 74 feet, 22.5 meters beneath the surface, were live bombs just waiting to accidentally blow a diver into pieces. These two have since been handled by the U.S. Army, but there could be more down there just waiting, posing incredible danger to unsuspecting tourists. Would you go diving here knowing that there are literal bombs from World War II hidden in the corals that could blow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button before the end of this video. Number 4. SS Bloody Marsh. The SS Bloody Marsh has been lost since 1943, but it may have just been discovered about 100 miles, 160 kilometers off the coast of South Carolina, approximately 78 years after it was split in half by a German U-boat. The discovery was made by researchers with the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They say that based on what they discovered with their remotely operated camera, the vehicle is almost definitely the SS Bloody Marsh. It's the same size, it's located in the right spot, and it appears to be a match. But what they found most fascinating was the level of destruction on the floor of the ocean. The ship was literally in pieces, like a great hump of crumpled metal that barely even looked like a ship anymore. The SS Bloody Marsh was on its maiden voyage in July of 1943, carrying 106,000 barrels of oil. But before it made it very far, it was struck by a torpedo. 3 men on board were killed when the engine room flooded, and 20 minutes later, it was broken in half and rapidly sinking. Until this recent potential discovery, it's remained lost to history. Number 3. Wet Assault Rifle. A pair of magnet fishermen in the Netherlands were looking for interesting stuff in a river when they uncovered artifacts left behind from World War II. One of these artifacts was a wet assault rifle, a Sturmgewehr 44. This was one of the very first assault rifles ever manufactured. And that's not the only thing they discovered either. They found hand grenades, dog tags, and machine guns from both sides of the conflict. As you may already know, the Netherlands was the scene of fierce fighting between the Germans and the Allies. First, the Germans invaded it in 1940, then the Allies liberated it in 1944. And because the Netherlands is a country of canals, ponds, streams, and rivers, it's no surprise that so much war memorabilia is hiding just under the water. These guys found all this stuff using metal detectors and wetsuits. They basically splash around through rivers and ponds until they find cool stuff. And while they pulled up other guns like German MP40s and even a German MG15 machine gun, the Sturmgewehr 44 is by far one of the coolest. Number 2. German Dive Bombers. An exceptionally rare bomber from World War II was recently found in the Adriatic Sea. The bomber was part of the German Army, a Junkers Ju-87. It was shot down over 70 years ago and landed in the water near the Croatian island of Zrća. The reason this is such a rare type of bomber is that there were only 5,700 of them ever produced. Only 2 of them are still around today, with one on display at a museum in London and the other in Chicago. Finding the remains of one of these bombers, even if it is 91 feet, 27 meters beneath the surface of the water, is still something of a miracle. To make it even more amazing, the plane is still resting on its wheels as though it came to a gentle landing on the seabed. The rest of the aircraft is also in pretty good condition, albeit a little green after spending so much time underwater. It's believed the plane was probably shot down by Yugoslavia's army in April of 1941 as the German powers invaded. It'd be nice if the bomber could be recovered and preserved, but it's unclear yet if anyone is going to go through the trouble of actually pulling it out of the ocean. Number 1. The USS Johnson. The USS Johnson was blown apart during a firefight with a host of Japanese ships in October of 1944. It was the 25th of October to be exact, and the fighting was happening near Samar Island in the Philippines. The captain of the ship was Ernest Evans, the first Native American Navy captain to be awarded with the Medal of Honor. Although sadly he received the Medal of Honor after death. You see, he was one of the 186 members of the crew who died when the ship was bombarded by the Japanese. But his heroic actions that day meant the rest of the crew, the other 141 soldiers on board, were saved. After the ship sank, nobody saw it until 2019 when the ship was located 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. After it was located, a crew was put together and the deepest wreck dive in history was carried out to visit the USS Johnson 76 years after it was destroyed. There's no way the ship can be brought back to the surface, but the divers did get some spectacular photographs of one of the most advanced ships in the US Navy during World War II. What's your favorite sunken relic from World War II? Let me know in the comments, and thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hit subscribe if you liked what you saw, and come back soon for more amazing videos right here on American Eye.